Sup! So today I want to take you through a really basic fashion illustration tutorial. Alright, so today I'm going to walk you through a really basic hand tutorial. So these are some hands I drew yesterday, so you can get an example of what we'll be doing today. I'll probably actually do some in the same positions as what we have here, mostly because I recorded this all yesterday and then the file didn't save. So this is round 2, and now we've got some lovely examples and we're going to use that to go forward. So basically, I'm doing this in the context of like fashion illustration. So why that is important is because there are so many different ways that you can approach drawing hands, and if you're going for like a finished realistic hand, then these are not going to cut it. For fashion illustration, it's actually like super simple what you want, because you're trying to get the message across really quickly in just like a small gesture or a couple of lines without going into too much detail. So for fashion illustration, these have actually probably got too much detail, borderline anyway. So what I wanted to do is show you some examples where I have traced over models on the catwalk, just so you can get an idea of how basic the hands actually are. Because when you're doing a fashion croquis based on a catwalk model, keep in mind that even though you elongate the rest of the body, you don't actually elongate the hands themselves. So the hands should say roughly their exact size that they are in the original picture or reference that you use. Alright, so moving on from that, just gonna put our supplies to the side. I've got a couple of hands on here, but this is probably fine to work from. This is an example of like a super basic hand that you could do for fashion illustration, and that would honestly tick the box for that. But basically, in terms of supplies, what we have here is just a really basic sketch pad that was just a cheapie from my local Officeworks, which is just a local stationery store in Australia. I'm going to use a couple of different pencils. I will go harder with the lines for this tutorial than I normally will, because in order for it to show up on camera, it needs to be a lot bolder. So just keep that in mind, because on paper like this, where you've got like a cheap sketch pad, it's actually quite hard to remove the lines later on. And no matter how much you erase, you'll still see them. Plus, the more you erase, the more you'll damage your paper. Okie doke. So I'm just gonna get this all set up. Got my coffee here ready to go. And I'm going to pull up some references on my own screen. I won't be able to include them because I'm just going to use references from Google for this. But, you know, you can find references fairly easy for hands. I think if you're just drawing for the sake of like practicing gesture, then it probably doesn't matter so much about having having references that are specifically made for artists. So for example, there's websites like, is it Pexels? Like Pexels, I believe, where it's like copyright-free imagery. Or there's Museum by Sketchy, which is an app that I often use when I want to practice drawing faces. But for hands, I'm doing this in the intention that this is going absolutely nowhere. We're just doing it to just get an idea of how to actually draw hands. Before we go any further, I think let's just have a quick chat about why we're starting hands now. I know people hate to draw hands. It's something that I think brings up a lot of fear for people, even for me as an artist that practices pretty much daily sketching. If not, I'm using some kind of painting or art medium every single day. Unless I've been actively practicing hands, I lose that skill really fast. So I think when you're approaching it, remember that your skill level is going to vary day to day. It's going to vary depending how much practice you've been doing. If you've never drawn hands before, they're going to be awful, and that's just your starting point. Like, it's just, the sooner you can accept that you're going to suck in the beginning, the quicker you can get past that sucky stage. But it's just part of it. And I think as well, when you're drawing hands, like sometimes the sucky illustrations of hands can be pretty funny later on, and you can actually come up with quite a creative style based on that. So This tutorial is going to be assuming that you're just doing really basic style hands that you're probably using for fashion croquis or illustrations, or maybe they're just like basic sketches. If you're doing like fully shaded pieces, this isn't the tutorial for you, so just keep that in mind before we get started too. Okay, so we're going to dig into it. I'm just going to use another part of this page because this isn't a finished piece, it's going nowhere. I hate wasting materials, so we're just going to use the corner of the page here, and then if we need a new sheet later, that's what we'll do. So I'm going to take this pencil first. So this is a mechanical pencil. It's a Pentel Graph Gear 500. So I'm using the 0.3 HB. I'm just going to use this to give some really nice basic lines for the underlying structure, and we'll get started on that now. So how you want to start is by marking out the basic shape, and this applies for everything that you draw. So hands actually are not a bad place to start with that because hands are so complex, it actually forces you to pay quite a bit of attention to do it right, and I think that's kind of good when you're learning how to draw, even if it is daunting. So what I've basically done here is a rectangle-ish shape with a circle to mark in the base of the wrist, and then we're going to, off this angle here, we need sort of like a little polygon type thing. It's a little bit triangular, that comes off to mark in the thumb. This is giving us the direction of the hand. I find actually, so this helps me mark the width of the wrist, but actually it also reminds me that we're drawing a 3D object. I think that's sometimes where people go wrong with hands is they're so complicated and we get a lot of anxiety about doing them, so we just want to rush through it as quickly as we can, and sometimes we forget to include the bones. So we don't want to forget the bones. We don't want to forget the bones, and we're going to just use this to remind us it's a 3D structure as well as to work as the base of the wrist. So while I'm here, I might actually just mark this out. So we've got this little bone here. I can't remember the name of that. I'm actually studying figure drawing specifically at the moment, so I should have all of these well and truly within my language right now, but I do not. All right. So we started with a rectangle, we added our little like polygon thingo, we've got our circle for the base of the wrist. We are going to just drag down the wrist there, or the idea of the forearm, and then I tend to come in next and mark the knuckles. Different people will approach hands in different ways, and honestly I probably approach every hand differently as well. Like, it's not a one size fits all recipe for like drawing hand success. It's like, this is how I'm drawing this hand for now, and this basic approach is how I probably approach all hands, but not in a way where I'm like concisely following step by step. Again, so I'm also correcting things as I go along. So I noticed that this rectangle was going too far out. I'm always measuring things with my eyes. I think that's something that when you start drawing more, you'll notice that's how you can kind of figure out where you are on the page. So I'm never just looking at like this finger and trying to like guess the size of it. I'm always measuring it. So I'm measuring the location, I'm measuring it to contrast the size between other landmarks around it. And that's why as I go along, I'll keep correcting, because sometimes it might be a case of like I draw this finger super long and then before I know it, this thumb is like way off, and yeah, you just have to be able to correct as you go. So after we do that, we're gonna draw in a line for the first row of knuckles, and then I'm gonna have a rough idea for the second, but this is likely to change later. I'm doing it on an angle because there's a bit of foreshortening with the picture I'm looking at. So as they go further off into the distance, they're getting smaller, but it's fairly exaggerated for like the pinky, for example. Next, I will actually start marking in lines for the direction of each finger, and also just so that I remember to do the correct amount of fingers, which sounds ridiculous, but there have absolutely been times where I've been illustrating or sketching or whatever, and I've not been like you know, super vigilant on what I'm doing, I get to the end and then realize that I have 6 fingers or 4 fingers, and that is always very embarrassing, especially when you're doing it live. All right, so for the second knuckle out plus the like actual fingertip, I tend to just do like a bit of an oval shape that sort of encompasses both of those. Again, it'll depend on the angle that you're seeing the hand, how much detail you need there, and how much length you need there. You've always got your own hands to refer to as well. Don't forget that. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in, like, you know, you're looking at a reference picture and you don't quite understand what's happening, and then you might get a bit overwhelmed, but you can actually always just try and get your own hand in that same position, or even create your own reference pictures. For hands, that's not too hard to do. All right, so we've got our first finger-ish. We're gonna then bring in a line for the second finger. So the second knuckle is actually hidden behind this finger, so don't let that catch you off guard. And then we've got our next knuckle down here. It's pretty much touching the fleshy part of that top finger, and then I just do my little like oval cap kind of shape. Alrighty, and then our third finger, so there's a gap between these two where this one ends and where this one begins. I don't know, there's just a space. Alright, so then bringing in our second knuckle, and we want to cap that one off as well. And then we're going to come over here and do our pinky finger. This one's quite important in this particular image because it's going to help us understand the direction of the hand and the overall like silhouette of the hand, I guess. All right, coffee break. Okay, so what I have here is the basic shape of the hand. Now what I like to do is I tend to come in and just sort of block it in a little bit clearer now. Remembering this knuckle here, even though we've made that into an oval, it may have quite a bend there, it may not be too much of a bend. You want to acknowledge to some degree that that is a knuckle and there is potential for that to bend. I'm going to bring this down. That's overlapping on the, let's have a look at our own hand because the reference picture isn't clear. Okay, see this line here? You want to include details like that because it gives you an idea of direction and I guess proximity to the hand, in the sense that I can see that this thumb is sitting behind the rest of the hand slightly. Otherwise, you know, you don't want to make it look like you're extending it. You don't want to ignore that altogether and just like cover that up because that doesn't tell us any information then. So in the particular position that I'm drawing, I also, you may notice, I don't really sketch how you're meant to sketch. I'm still trying to get better at that. I tend to like hold on to my pencil for dear life, and that's not a good habit to be in, but you just have to like tackle one thing at a time, right? I was out of practice as drawing for a while there because I've spent so much time painting and focusing on getting better with painting, and it's only been recently that I've picked up drawing again, and I didn't realize how much I missed it, but there's something really nice about drawing and just having, you know, even half an hour to myself to just sketch is a good thing for my brain. So we're just kind of marking in where these fingers are going. Sometimes when you've got objects drawing through, it can actually be helpful to literally draw them through with light lines. So is the key. So for this particular example, I'm going darker than I would normally because I want it to show up on the video, and I may struggle to remove some of these construction lines, but we're just gonna make it make sense on camera because, as I said, these pieces aren't going anywhere. It's just kind of drawing practice. Okay, so we want to make sure we include that gap. That's important information for the viewer, and we need to acknowledge this knuckle here a little bit better. So bring that up a bit. When you're doing hands for fashion illustration, they'll be a lot smaller, so you wouldn't worry spending this much time on them or going into this much detail, but we're going to start with this style of drawing first, and then we can work towards that. Alrighty, I am going to use my kneadable eraser. You can get these, but they're just like a couple of dollars, I reckon, at like your local stationery store, but they last forever, and I use it for everything. Let's see if it'll work on this. Again, it's better for fine lines. What I like about the kneadable razor is you can put it into any shape you want, so if you've got a really thin area, it's easy to get it in there. Honestly, another thing I like about them is they're just fun. Like, they're kind of just fun to use. I know you're not meant to say that, but oh well. And they also are quite gentle on the paper. So especially, I used to do a lot of watercolors, and I found using actual erasers sometimes would damage my paper, and that was really frustrating. So sometimes it's best to go with these because they're a lot gentler. Alright, so that's, just give it like a once over to see if we can pick up anything else as well. I also kind of want to get rid of some of those sketchy lines that I've put in there because they're not very aesthetic lines. It's also something else that I'm working on with my sketching at the moment. When you have lots of short, choppy lines when you're sketching, it just sort of makes it look like you don't know what you're doing. And so even if you do know what you're doing, it makes it look a bit amateur because it looks like you're indecisive and you're not quite sure if that's where the line should go. Alright, so we're gonna just start by outlining our hand. You want to make sure you capture the bumps that are sort of naturally going to be there as well. You don't want to, I mean, it could be a stylistic choice where you do want to exaggerate the bumps more than they are there, but you just want to at least acknowledge that this is like a human being and things aren't just like perfectly smooth on our bodies. Unless you are a freak. No, I shouldn't say that. Alright, we're just going to colour in that nail out of habit. You don't really need to do that. I'm going to come in and do our second knuckle. And I can see already I've got some construction issues here. Like, I haven't done this completely accurately. But in terms of giving you a tutorial for how to approach hands, I think it'll still help you. If I was doing this for like a final illustration, I would be going in to fix up some of this. So again, for this purpose, we're gonna just do some really just like rough lines to the knuckles. I'm not gonna spend forever actually shading those in. For a fashion illustration or a fashion croquis, it's very unlikely you'll include any of that information on it. You're basically just going to have the basic direction of hands and sort of capturing part of the gesture there to give people an idea what the hands are doing. Or even sometimes the hands aren't even really doing anything, so you're kind of just acknowledging that this is a human that has hands and that's all they're there for. Sounds ridiculous because it is. Alright, really bad job marking the fingernails, but that's just so you can see where they are. We're going to do that really rough knuckle mark on these ones as well, and then we're going to bring in this finger here. So I wanted to have that finger as my landmark for before I started the next one, which is why I did that one first. Bring this down here. So the underside of the hand is where you'll have, like, if you look at your own finger, you'll notice you have some, I guess, fleshy parts here, or like bulges normally. They're not normally crazy obvious. It depends on the finger, right? And like probably your personal anatomy, but also it'll depend on like if you're like swollen or whatever for whatever reason. So probably like temperature dependent too. But generally you can see there's a bit of a bump either side of that knuckle break. Marking in our nail again, and then I'm going to come in for the thumb. Actually, thumbs are my favorite fingers to draw. I don't really know why. They're quite satisfying. I think because they give so much information to the viewer. So it's like once you get the thumb in, you kind of like, you've set yourself up for success. Alrighty, just gonna acknowledge that little dip there, bring that back out, add our super great nail polish and knuckle lines. There we go. So it's by no means a perfect hand. Again, I'm just doing this to give you the gist of how to approach it. These ones from yesterday are probably actually better, to be honest. That's either the same or just a very similar pose to the one that I just did now. And I think I probably did that one better yesterday. So this is what I mean as well, where it's like some days I just draw better hands than others, and if I could make that more consistent, that would be sick. And I think that just comes down to practice. Alrighty, so we're gonna move on to doing, I wanna do a person holding a bag. Alright, so if you think about the types of hands that you'll be drawing for fashion illustration, they're gonna quite commonly be, they're walking on the catwalk, so their hands are gonna be sort of like this almost, or like that, or they're holding a bag, so it's kind of, that's what you're getting from the side. You may sometimes see more fingers than that, but I encourage you to go and actually look at catwalk pictures just so you can see how little or how much actual hand you're getting into it, because that'll, I think, frame the way that you choose to practice drawing these hands too. So I found myself a picture of a lady holding a bag. It's a fairly simple picture, but I'm just going to do it for an example of how you'd approach that. So it's the same method of starting with that rectangular kind of shape. We want to then bring our thumb off to the side, get that little guy ready to go there. The knuckle is about here. I'm always comparing it to see, like, the thumb, if that's going to end there, then where does that line up with the knuckle, which would be about here. The second knuckle is actually slightly hidden, and same with the third one. And let's have a look. This one is actually like up here. So this is where the fingers, this is actually the, like, if that's our knuckle at the base of our hands, we're drawing these at the moment. So second knuckle along, because that's how it's holding the bag. So from the outside, you're seeing something like this. All right, so let's just give ourselves some nice little like tubes to understand how that sits. We'll add in our other base of the hand knuckles too. And then for this one, I don't really like, I mean, I'm going to do it just for the sake of it, but you don't really need to add the detail of each finger. It's going to be more about adding these little tubular shapes in to give us an idea of where they are overlapping and what information we can still see. Alrighty, so I'm going to mark in the handbag itself just to make it easier as we go along. It's good to have that landmark in there. And then I'm going to come right in and start doing the thumb. I'm going to tackle the front of the thumb. That would be the fingernail. I've got a little knuckle is about here. And dragging that up. That thumb seems kind of big in comparison to where I think the fingers will be size-wise, but let's just see how this goes for a little bit, and we'll correct later if we need to. Pulling that up. Can't actually see how far the wrist goes up, so, or the forearm at that point, I suppose, but we're just going to give ourselves the gist of it. I'm going to also come in on this side here and give myself some markers there. This pinky, it actually extends down the full way, so you can actually see the fingernail on that one. The rest of them are all curled under. There's a couple of fingertips showing on this side. I'm going to add in one of them, but sometimes elements like that will just become distracting to the eye, so you need to sort of Make some judgment calls, like what is actually adding to the story, what gives you context that you need, and what is just going to clutter and make it difficult for the eye to know where to focus. Okie doke. So now we're going to come through and start actually outlining this in bold. This nail is probably a bit long, but we're going to roll with it. I think the biggest thing with drawing anything like hands or faces is just going to be practice. And also just accepting that, yeah, some days are just better drawing days than others. And even when I am doing a lot of practice at drawing specifically, I will still have days where I just absolutely suck. I just think like some days my brain is just not fully functioning with me in a visual way, and that comes out in my drawing for sure. It's something I can hide better when I paint. I don't know if that's the same for other artists out there. I'd love to hear from you if it is the same for you. With painting, there seems to be, I can get away with, you know, painting in an off mood a little bit more than I can get away with painting if I'm drawing in an off mood. That probably comes down to patience as well. So when I'm painting something and I'm not really in the mood for it, because the medium sort of helps you along the process, and sometimes, you know, you'll have what we call a happy accident that you can just roll with. I have more patience for that than I do when I'm trying to draw and just force something that my brain doesn't want to do that day. But it is frustrating. Like if you are trying to improve and you have a lot of off days, you just like get to a point where you're like, am I even meant to be doing this? Clearly not. It's not working for me. But at the end of the day, it's just going to be time. Like it's always one of those things where people want to know how to get better at things quicker, and people don't like when the answer is practice. Okay, so let me erase some of these lines so you can see that a little bit better. In some ways that was better than the last one, in other ways not so much, but we're gonna take what we can from it anyway. So let's just get rid of some of those lines. Ta-da! Not really, it's like a little bit av, but that's fine. All right, pulling that, pulling that down. Oh my God. Okay, that got really choppy, but you saw it before I made it choppy. Mark in our fingernail, just because that's what I do. Pretty basic hand, but that's what we're going for with this tutorial, just to give you the basic introduction of how to draw them. So let's move along. I want to do now some specific fashion illustration hands for you. There's something else which I think is worth mentioning when you're learning to draw hands, and it's not something I've seen other people talk about. I think it's one of those things where it's a little bit frowned upon, but when you're a beginner at something and everything you draw just looks shit, and especially with hands where people already have so much anxiety about drawing them, it can become really defeating really quickly. And I don't want you to get defeated and stop what you're doing. I'd rather give you a helpful hint which may or may not be accepted within the art community, but if you're not in the art community, then go for it. So I actually find when I'm learning to draw things, if like before I get to a point where I've practiced it enough that I can actually like spread my wings, go out my own, and quite confidently do that, it's actually really helpful to use references of actual drawings. Like rather than looking at hands themselves, it can be a little bit overwhelming because things look different when you actually see them to when you try and convey them on paper. So even though these are like fairly accurate to what I could see, because you know there's been some small mistakes in the line work or small mistakes in my proportions, and there's no shading, immediately it'll just look like a 3-year-old has drawn it and you'll want to quit. So when you look at other illustrations and the final products of those illustrations, that will give you a better idea of how your basic structure of the drawing should look. So I want to be clear, I'm not saying to copy anyone's work, and especially like don't copy it and then try and sell it as being your work. However, I do think if you look at other people's final illustrations of hands or faces or whatever it is, and then use that to practice drawing from, you'll actually notice a lot of growth in your own work a lot quicker. Illustration hands in particular, I'm going to borrow a little bit from someone who I've learned from, who is Zoe Hong. She is incredibly talented at teaching fashion illustration, so I want to definitely credit to her for this particular technique or approach I'm about to use. So definitely like huge shout out to her because she helped me along my journey. It's that thing where you're gonna have a lot of different teachers when you're trying to learn something, and you can learn something from all of them. So I'm not trying to be better than anyone else here or say that my way is more correct than others. It's more I'm putting together information from all of the sources I've ever learned from, plus my own experience, to hopefully make your path a little bit easier. Alright, so we've got our basic wrist, which I've done too big, so I've just come in to fix that. And then we're going to come in and do these thumbs. So we just want to give ourselves a little marker there. We put in our circles for each knuckle, and now we're going to come in with the shape of the index finger. If you left it there, it can kind of look a little bit strange, so we're going to add in these other fingers here. So as you can see, sometimes I'll bother doing the directional lines, other times I won't really. Always consider which fingers you'll actually be able to see and which ones add to the story, I guess. Because we're not doing like an in-depth figure drawing of hands here, we're just going for like gestural fashion illustration type hands. Less is going to be more. So you want to give people the direction so they understand what the hand is doing and they understand it's a hand. But if you go too much beyond that, I think it just can take away from the actual point of your piece, which should be, in this instance, fashion illustration. Alrighty, so that's sort of the basic shape of one of the most common hand shapes you'll be doing with fashion illustration. Just because they're, the models are walking down the catwalk, they're trying to not draw too much attention to their hands, and there is something within like human psychology where we are always drawn to hands and faces. So I am not a model, but I am assuming part of their job is to just make sure their hands aren't distracting. They're not accidentally pointing at things. They're just sort of, being as unintrusive as possible. If, you'll notice yourself doing it. If someone pulls their hand up and starts touching their face, you'll immediately want to look at their face. Even when people speak and they use their hands, you're definitely drawn in by their hands a lot more. So we just need to be careful about how we draw the hands in our pictures too, because otherwise they'll become a distraction. Alright, so that's our basic like walking down the catwalk, and if we go back to the original examples I showed, we can see we've got quite a few of those happening along here. So this was a direct trace on top of catwalk pictures I had, which is pretty similar to what I've got there if you look at that now. Comparing that one, that was obviously like these are tiny, which is the other thing, right? Like you just want to be careful with your line work for them. This is probably the only one which has clear enough line work which I'd consider using within an illustration. The others are a little bit too choppy, and granted they were for the point of illustration, but I just think I find that quite distracting. All right, just humor me for a moment while I fill these in. Okay. The other hand, which I see quite a lot on catwalk images in particular is going to be holding the bag. So similar to this, but more in like tiny bag holding version. So again, we're not scaling the hands up at all when we draw these catwalk croquis, because otherwise we're going to end up with like these monster hands which steal the show, and that's absolutely not the point of the illustration. If you want to go off and do like a weird sci-fi thing where your hands are 3 times the size they're meant to be, then absolutely go for it. I will support you stylistically, but not not in terms of actual anatomy. Alright, so we're going to mark in roughly the sort of directional line here. This one's a little bit trickier, so we've got a kind of side angle, so actually rather than doing lines to each finger, we're going to mark in our wrist, but I'll come down and do little chunky boys just like this. Remember as well, your fingers aren't all the same sizes. Sounds ridiculous, but it does need to be pointed out. So you can definitely see that there. What you don't want to do is do like these 3 fingers to be the same size, because that will look really weird. Granted, with foreshortening and movement, sometimes that gets lost anyway, but if you are overdrawing a hand, like for example this one where you can see them quite clearly, that would look bizarre to the eye if those 2 are the same length. Okay, coming back to this little guy over here, we're going to mark in the outside shape of the hand. We're going to catch that knuckle and make sure that we make it seem kind of human. So we don't want it to be too perfect, because then it just doesn't look human. That knuckle's slightly bigger, it's probably jutting out a little bit as well. We'll come down to this guy. You can see more of that finger at the base of it, so pull that up and we'll put in that knuckle end there. But we've then got this little pinky guy which is curling back in. So because of that, you can see a little bit more of this finger here too. That's a little bit too much, but you get the gist. This side here, we'll just come in and start marking that in. Pull the finger back up. Add that little line there. That guy, I mean, for me, I wouldn't use this because I've screwed that line up there. But the other thing as well, when you're doing fashion illustration, you're probably going to do a lot of layers where you've got like tracing paper to fix things up and have around two in it. So I guess that's where sometimes I can be a little bit lazy in my first layer of sketching, because in my head I'm like, oh, I'll just fix it on layer 2. Except when you're filming it, there is no layer 2. So just tidy that up a little bit. But yeah, you can kind of see like that's a basic like fist. You can see how that would be holding a hand. Okay. I think that pretty much sums it up. I won't go into the detail of this one at this stage now. If that is something you're interested to know about, I can teach that one in another class. But what we've covered here are just like really basic how to draw hands. I think we've also covered things like some days you're going to be worse than others, which is important to know for your own motivation. Also just accepting you're going to be shit to start with, and that's okay. And the only way to get through that is to keep drawing more. And just keeping it simple, as well as like simple in terms of how you approach the lines as well. So similar to how I'm working on making my lines less choppy. As we saw, every time I screwed it up, it was like that choppy line thing getting me. It's a bad habit that I'm trying to get out of. Don't get into it if you haven't started it yet. We want long, smooth, graceful lines which show us the gesture of where we're looking without interrupting the gaze. Again, I think that covers everything. So thank you all for watching today. I hope that was helpful. If you've got any questions or requests, please let me know. Otherwise, I plan to do a series to teach you how to do fashion illustration the way that I've learned how to do it. And this is just the first class of that. So hopefully that's helpful. I hope you all have a wonderful day. And you know what? Just keep on keeping on. All right, bye.